Steamboats were the preferred method of water transportation before there were any other methods. This was especially true during the Civil War, and so when the war ended, many people wanted to get home. In 1865, one steamboat offered to take them all. Sadly, this would be the last journey of that ship. This is the Sultana Steamboat Disaster, Part 1. The year is 1865. The location is New Orleans, Louisiana. After years of bloody fighting, the Civil War has finally come to an end. There is celebrating, in the streets and on the docks. People are crowded together, eager to go home. They have been stuck here for too long. The work is not fun, and the parties are tiring. Everyone wants to get out of the city. That's why everyone is waiting for the Sultana. It is a side-wheel steamer. It has two huge wheels on the sides of the ship that steer it through the water, but it also has a shallow draft, meaning that it can travel into very shallow parts of the Mississippi River. It was built for these exact circumstances. Unfortunately, what people don't know is that it may not be able to handle the crowd of people waiting to board it. The Sultana had been chartered by American General Philip Sheridan. He planned on transporting soldiers back north from New Orleans, up the river to Cairo, Illinois. From there, they could travel east and get home. However, General Grant believed that there were still Confederates in the area. He did not want 3,000 Union soldiers traveling along the river without protection, so he ordered 2,000 soldiers to stay behind. Unfortunately, the general was wrong. The Confederate forces were gone, and so everyone wanted to leave. The soldiers weren't going to ask questions. That's why Captain J.Q. Smith set off down the river with a ship full of people. Some were soldiers, but others were just regular civilians. The lower deck was filled with bales of cotton and barrels of sugar. On top of that was a boiler room, then more people, then another deck. On the top deck were more people, and the saloon. And then above that was the captain's quarters. What should have been a trip of around 10 days turned into a week. The reason was overcrowding. The Sultana was meant to carry 400 passengers. However, that was just an estimate. Nobody actually knew how much the ship could really hold. It was assumed that the ship had been reinforced, and it should be able to hold double its weight. Even still, it was being pushed to the limit, and because the trip was taking longer than expected, people were getting pretty restless. Things were cramped and hot, and some people were starting to think about turning back. Now, most people assumed that the ship was in bad shape because it was overloaded. And while that's probably true, we can't be sure. Before the trip began, many people complained that the ship had holes in it. There was a 3-inch hole near the boiler room. Also, it was said that every time the ship went over a wave, water would splash into that hole. Nobody knows if that hole was fixed before the trip or if it was patched poorly. We also know that a fire broke out on the ship soon after it left New Orleans. Thankfully, the crew was able to put it out before it got out of hand. But it's hard to say exactly how the fire started or how it was put out. All we have are rumors. Rumors aside, though, things were looking good. By April 27th, the ship was approaching Memphis, Tennessee. The trip had taken longer than expected, but it hadn't sunk yet, and the people on board were feeling pretty safe. What happened next would change everything, though. As the ship approached Memphis, it slowed down to prepare to dock. But then, it started moving again. The ship lurched forward and everyone fell. At first, people thought that they had hit something in the water. Maybe it was a log, or maybe it was a sandbar. The reality was much worse, though. The ship was being pushed toward a new dock where more people were waiting to board the ship, and it seemed like it might hit that dock head-on. The crew was trying to stop the ship by reversing the engines, but it wasn't working. Everyone was screaming as they realized what was about to happen. The ship was going to explode. While people were running for their lives, the ship reversed quickly. Suddenly, there was a giant explosion, and everyone was thrown into the water. Part of the ship had broken off, and now the main engine was exposed. The entire thing had caught on fire. The boilers had exploded, and now everyone had to fight their way to the surface of the water. Some people had been burned badly and were too injured to help themselves. Others were trapped under the wood and couldn't get out. Many people had also swallowed water and were struggling to keep their heads above the surface. The river didn't help either. It was said that the current was so strong that day that if you let yourself be swept away, you wouldn't be seen again. Many people tried to grab onto the wreckage of the ship, but it was no use. Within a few minutes, the fire had spread and consumed the whole ship. The only thing standing was the smokestack. As the sun went down that night, it must have looked like a giant was sticking his finger up at the sky. But while the sun was setting, another ship was sailing past. The captain of that ship saw the smoke and decided to turn around. He was surprised to see all those people in the water. He tried to help them, but the current was too strong. He couldn't get close enough. He did the best he could, but he couldn't save everyone. He wasn't prepared for a rescue mission. Thankfully, there was a man who was. His name was John A. Logan. He was the Secretary of the Treasury. He saw that there were people in the water and immediately ordered his boat to go in and save them. But even he couldn't save everyone. Many people had already drowned, but he did manage to save 300 people. They were freezing cold, but they were alive. In total, 800 people died that day, making this the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history. Many people died because the ship was overloaded, but others died because they were never given a chance. To be fair to the crew, they weren't expecting to sink. The explosion happened suddenly, and there wasn't anything they could do to prevent it. After the ship exploded, there were 3 main theories as to what caused it. The first was that the boilers had simply exploded because of all the extra weight on the ship. The second was that the crew had tried to patch up the holes in the ship, but they had done such a poor job that the patches failed. The third theory was that someone had tampered with the ship. It was rumored that a Confederate spy had planted explosives on board, but there's no proof that that actually happened. We will never know what caused the ship to explode, but we do know why it sank. The hole that had been near the boiler room was filled with water. As the ship tilted, the water moved to the front of the ship. When the boilers exploded, the water came gushing out and caused the ship to sink even faster. Even before the boilers exploded, the ship was doomed. It was overloaded, and it was in bad shape. But there was nothing that could have been done to prevent the sinking. Once the boilers exploded, though, there was no hope. In the aftermath of the explosion, many people pointed fingers. The steamboat company was blamed. The government was blamed. The captain was even blamed. But the truth was, nobody was to blame. It was just an unfortunate accident. Still, though, people wanted someone to pay. The steamboat company was sued, the people on board filed paperwork, and the government tried to find someone to blame. In the end, nobody was held responsible. Many people had died, and many families were left without money. The steamboat company simply refused to pay. The government said that it wasn't their responsibility, and the lawsuits went nowhere. The families of the dead were told that their loved ones had died trying to help the country. They should be honored. By that, not compensated for it. It's hard to say what the families were thinking, but it's likely that they understood. Still, the whole thing was tragic. Families were ripped apart, and the United States lost 1/800 of its people in a single day. To this day, the Sultana Steamboat Disaster is the worst maritime disaster in U.S. history. It's also the largest mass casualty event in U.S. history. Both of those records are pretty sad to hold, but at least the event isn't forgotten. Every year on April 27th, people gather by the river to remember the lives that were lost. They remember the 1/800 men, women, and children who were on the ship and the lives that they could have lived. Now watch. Why did the Titanic sink, or check out the deadliest hurricanes to ever hit the United States? Everything was going well for the first few hours of the Sultana's journey. The food was good, the drinks were flowing, and people were having a great time celebrating the end of the Civil War. But after dark, when the moon was high in the sky, everything changed. A sudden explosion rocked the ship from stem to stern, throwing people to the floor. Screams filled the night air as people ran around in panic, not knowing what had happened. What was that horrible sound? Where was it coming from? And why did the floor suddenly feel like it was vibrating? These questions raced through everyone's mind. There was no time to think, no time to react. People could only scream at the top of their lungs as they felt the world around them change in an instant. But what had happened? Well, the boiler of the steamboat, which had been leaking all day, gave way. Explosions ripped through the vessel as superheated steam blasted out of the broken holes. The force of the blast was so great that it threw the captain off his feet. 1 minute he was standing by the wheel at the helm, ready to navigate the Mississippi River. The next minute he was staring at the underside of a table. The passengers weren't so lucky. Some had been thrown overboard into the dark waters of the river, while others were hanging on for dear life, desperately trying to get a foothold on the wreckage that was once the deck of the boat. Others were still running around the boat, which had now become a drifting tomb, looking for a way out, an escape from the disaster that was unfolding before their eyes. Now, some people managed to jump into the river. For them, it was a case of being in the right place at the right time. They had been standing near the edge of the boat when the explosion happened, so they simply leapt into the water and swam away from the wreckage. Others, who had been sitting in the middle of the ship, were less fortunate. They scrambled for the exits, tripping over one another in a desperate attempt to save themselves. But it was too late. There was no escape. As the boat began to sink, the water temperature rose rapidly. It was like stepping into a hot tub. Some people screamed with delight at the unexpected heat, while others were confused as to why the water suddenly became so warm. It didn't take long for the passengers to realize the reason for this strange phenomenon. The river was boiling. Superheated steam from the explosions below deck was rising up through the water, turning it into a monstrous cauldron. The water boiled furiously, making swimming almost impossible. Those that had jumped into the river struggled to keep their heads above the frothing water, and those left on the sinking ship screamed in terror as they watched the river turn from calm and serene to a raging inferno. It must have looked like something straight out of hell itself. That's what would have crossed the minds of those unfortunate enough to witness this disaster. As the night wore on and the Sultana continued to sink, the river began to clear. The passengers who had jumped into the water were either nowhere to be seen or were floating face down in the water, their bodies starting to become limp. This wasn't because they had tired themselves out from swimming. No, this was the work of the water itself, which seemed to be reaching up from the depths of the river, snatching the passengers from the surface and dragging them down into the muddy darkness. This is what happened to Captain Hansen. 1 minute, he was helping passengers into lifeboats, and the next, he found himself sucked under the water. He tried his best to fight against the current, but it was futile. He was pulled further and further, down until it was impossible to see the light of the moon above. He struggled for a few moments before his strength gave out, and he went completely still. His body floated to the bottom of the river, where it was met by countless others who had suffered the same fate. On the deck of the sinking boat, people were getting desperate. They knew that it was only a matter of time before the entire ship went under. So they started grabbing onto anything they could find in an attempt to save themselves. Life jackets, chairs, tables, even the mast of the ship. Some of these items were more useful than others. The life jackets helped keep people afloat, while the furniture quickly became waterlogged and dragged their owners further down into the water. Still, people held on to them anyway. Better to drown with a chair than without one, or so they thought. One woman, Mrs. A.M. Randall, used her skirts to help keep herself afloat. She managed to stay upright in the water for a long time, but eventually the material became waterlogged, and she was forced to abandon her makeshift life jacket. Fortunately for her, she was close to shore and was soon rescued by men in a waiting boat. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case for many others. For instance, there was the case of Mr. James Walsh, who managed to get himself a life jacket and then grabbed hold of a piece of furniture to help keep himself afloat. This worked for quite a while, but after midnight, when the water began to boil, he lost his grip on the furniture and had to let go. By this point, he was exhausted and had lost hope of being saved, and so when a lifeboat came by and he was asked if he could swim, his response was, "No, sir, I can't swim. I'll die before I'll leave this boat." But the rescuers didn't care. They reached out and grabbed him, pulling him from the water and hauling him aboard. Exhausted, he was wrapped in blankets and given hot tea to drink. Soon his strength was restored, and he was able to walk. If the men hadn't come for him just then, he would have died of exhaustion soon after. By 4 a.m., the river was calm once again. The Sultana had sunk into the murky depths and taken all of its passengers and crew with it, except for a few. Only a handful of people survived the disaster, which claimed an estimated 1,800 lives. Most of the survivors had been sleeping in the cabins below deck when the explosion happened. This gave them precious minutes of warning, which they used to grab life jackets and jump into the river. Others who had been traveling on the upper deck or in the pilot house were less lucky. After the sun rose and people realized the extent of the disaster, rescue boats combed through the wreckage. They found the bodies of men, women, and children, some floating on the surface of the water, while others were tangled up in the debris. Many of the bodies were badly burned. This was because the boiler explosion had also ignited the wood and coal on board the ship. Survivors described a horrific scene, one that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. President Andrew Johnson declared May 27, 1865, the day of the disaster, a national day of mourning. Flags were lowered to half-staff, and people across the country were encouraged to wear black and pray for the souls of those lost on the Sultana. The president himself attended a memorial service in the capital. But despite these somber events, not everyone was sympathetic to the plight of the dead. Some newspapers accused the ship's captain of murder, saying that he should have known that the boiler was about to explode and done more to prevent the disaster. Others blamed the soldiers for causing the accident, saying that they had overloaded the ship. However, most people understood that accidents happen. They sent their condolences to the families of those lost and hoped that the country could move on from this tragedy. But that wasn't easy. For the families of the victims, the pain never really went away. Every year on the anniversary of the disaster, they gathered at the site of the explosion to lay flowers on the water and remember their loved ones. Some people even claimed that they saw ghosts on the anniversary, the ghosts of those who died on the Sultana. The Sultana Steamboat Disaster was the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history. It claimed more lives than the sinking of the Titanic and the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger combined. To this day, it remains one of the worst disasters ever to occur on American soil. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss out on any of our future videos. We'd also like to extend a special thanks to our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now.